Joining him was Dr. Don Thomas, a four-trip veteran and the science officer who had been expected to join Bowersox and the Russian cosmonaut Nikolai Budarin for their stay. Over 2 years of training at home and in Russia, in simulators and classrooms and T-38 jets, they had become Expedition 6. Thomas had also undergone a more sinister indoctrination. Without Earth's atmosphere to protect them, astronauts are exposed to higher than usual amounts of solar radiation. Because little is known about exactly how much exposure will trigger cancer, and rather than risk its astronaut core becoming lumpy with tumors, NASA has set an arbitrary radiation red line. Extensive medical investigation had revealed that Thomas, for whatever reason, had become unacceptably close to NASA's red line. The flight surgeons had passed on their findings to Mission Control and, in turn, to Bowersox. As the commander of Expedition 6, he had been left facing down 3 possible outcomes. He could choose to ignore the evidence and fight to allow Thomas to fly. He could see Thomas scratched from the mission and replaced with his backup, a rookie astronaut named Don Pettit. Or Bowersox could ground himself, Budarin, and Thomas, and order all 3 members of Expedition 6 replaced by their reserves. He had taken the options to bed with him and been surprised by how much time he spent turning them over. Through training and by nature, Bowersox had acquired a certain cool. He carried a sense of detachment with him almost always. A pilot's life, if he wants to see the end of it, doesn't hold a lot of room for romance, and Bowersox had mastered the hard art of bottling up his feelings. The walls he'd built carried clean through his eyes, which were the same hard glacier blue that had become a trademark of the best pilots, like Chuck Yeager's drawl or a strong chin. But here Bowersox struggled, even though the facts were plain. Thomas's health presented a risk, and a trip into space was marbled with enough risk already. That should have been all there was to it, and yet for one of the few times in his life, it was his turn to lie awake, allowing the data to be clouded by late-night sentiment. He had grown to like Thomas, a quiet, hard-working, serious-minded man, the sort whose hands never shook. Bowersox's affection for him was a particular kind of love. It meant that he was both comfortable in his company and confident in his abilities. He didn't want his friend killed with kindness, however, and he began casting his mind towards switching out the entire crew. It didn't take him long to shake off that option like a shiver. The clean sweep would have crushed Budarin and brought Thomas no closer to space. And in the honesty of his private company, Bowersox had to admit that his own itching to fly bordered on a sickness. He was 45 years old, almost 46, growing long-toothed by astronaut standards. Deep down, he knew his time was running out. He also knew there were dozens of astronauts lurking in the wings behind him, first stringers their entire lives who'd found themselves in the unnatural position of waiting, sometimes for 7, 8, 9 years, hoping that their phone would finally ring with the go-ahead. No part of Bowersox wanted to put a line through his own name in exchange for one of theirs. All of which had left him with a single option, replacing Thomas with Pettit, exchanging one Don for another, and in the process, learning how to think of a friend as though he was just another part of the machine. At Star City, an hour north of downtown Moscow, down a road cut through a green forest, a contingent of exiled Americans had gathered in the small cottage occupied by Don Pettit. He had been in Russia for more than a year, mostly going through the motions. Although he took his training seriously, he knew that as a reserve his chances of getting called up to join Expedition 6 were close to 0. Really, his agreeing to a semi-permanent exile was part of a grander plan he had drawn up for himself. For a rookie astronaut, clocking in as a backup was viewed favorably by those few, untouchable men in Houston who put together crews. So long as Pettit performed well enough in training, he would earn a better-than-average chance of one day making the trip to station. Pettit looked the part, at least every inch the science guy. Glasses hiding brown eyes, curly dark hair, an affinity for cargo pants held up by a belt full of tools. He was a chemical engineer, an inventor, a veteran explorer of molecules and optics rather than of space, a man who couldn't help wondering how engines worked, why clouds